Jim is the distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University now. Before that, he was, for I think 14 years, the executive director for the Canadian Association of University Teachers. And Jim also has written extensively on educational issues, a wide range of educational issues. His latest book is Academic Freedom and Conflict, which I think just came out last year, just a few months ago. So Jim is extraordinarily well qualified to talk to you about something that I think many of us are just beginning to become more aware of. We're really, really pleased that you could come. There'll be a question and answer period after Jim's talk. If you have questions, it would be great if you can participate with the question and answer period. And if you have, come on in. If you have questions or comments, if you could keep them fairly concise, reasonably concise, so that other people have a chance to say things and make comments and ask questions. So let's give a warm McMaster welcome to Jim Turk. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Don. I really appreciate the invitation to be here today. I'm feeling some pressure if you're saying that this talk has been advertised more than anything labor studies has ever advertised before. I hope it doesn't disappoint you. I'm wanting to talk about, as the title suggests, what I'm describing as the hollowing out of the university, a cancer of corporatization. And I want to begin, and I guess it's what academics do, is they qualify or have some preliminary comments before they get into the gist of it. And one is a note on corporatization. There's a vast literature on the corporatization of the university, which I've contributed to. But I have a problem with the term corporatization because it's often heard as saying that there's some disembodied process that's going on. I mean, corporatization is not a thing. Corporatization is the actions of a variety of people going in different directions. It's resulting in a pattern that I find to be a very disturbing pattern, but it's neither inevitable nor is it something outside of human agency. And I mentioned this at the beginning because what I'm going to end with is talking about what we can do to deal with some of the things I'm describing here. Universities come in many different shapes and sizes, types, but there are a few things that make universities unique as opposed to other kinds of educational institutions. One of them is that part of its mission is the advancement of knowledge. In addition to what other educational institutions, be they colleges or high schools, elementary schools, which are about educating students and about service to the institution and the community. Another part are two things that are essential to university institutional traditions that enable us to fulfill our mission. One of them is an organizational structure in which academic decisions are made by the academic community, and the other is an employment relationship in which one's duty is to the mission, not to the employer. In universities, unlike almost every other workplace, we in fact do not have a duty of loyalty to the employer. The first of these we call collegial governance, and the second we call academic freedom. And what I'm going to argue today is all three of these are being hollowed out in the contemporary university. So let me start with hollowing out the university's mission to advance knowledge. It's difficult to maintain that mission when research is not a part of the job description of an increasing proportion of academic staff. It's also difficult to maintain that tradition when funding for research, for those whose job does include research, is being diminished. And I want to talk a little bit about what's happening. But before I do that, I have to give my other qualifying note, and that is about Canadian post-secondary education data. We know about what faculty they are and what they do and who they are. historically in Canada as a result of a series of surveys. One is the UCAS survey, which was a survey of full-time academic staff. A second one was an equivalent survey of part-time university academic staff. A third was a survey of college educational staff. And fourthly was the mandatory long-form census, which provided the only data on a number of characteristics of university faculty, including ethnicity. Now, in the 1990s, the survey of part-time academic staff was ended, and we have no good data in Canada on part-time academic staff. About the same time, the survey of college academic staff in the mid-90s was ended. As you know, in 2010, the Harper government announced that it was discontinuing the mandatory long-form census. And in 2012, it ended the survey of, Statistics Canada ended the survey of full-time academic staff. So when the OECD or the United Nations produce data about university teachers, international data, they're going to be just massive numbers of blank columns when it comes to Canada. All of that is a long-winded way of apologizing for having to show you the pattern of what's happening in terms of the growth of contingent academic positions by using American data, where there are good data. This table looks at what's been happening to the changes in the numbers of full-time tenured positions, full-time tenure track positions, full-time non-tenure track positions, and part-time positions in degree-granting universities in the United States from 1975 to 2011, which are the most recent data available. So as you can see, in 1975, about 37% of faculty in American universities were full-time tenured. That has consistently fallen over this period of time. The number of full-time tenure track positions, likewise, has declined. The number of full-time non-tenure track positions has been increasing. We see these often in the creation of teaching-only positions and other positions that don't typically include the full range of academic work as part of the job description and for which the faculty member is supported by the institution. And then we have part-time positions, which you can see the trend. So in the United States currently, more than 70% of faculty teaching in degree-granting institutions are neither tenured or tenure track. In Canada, we simply do not have reliable data. We have a lot of anecdotal data, and unfortunately the plural of anecdote is not data. A survey that was done in Carleton a decade ago, looking at who taught the undergraduate courses, taking all the course titles, found that more than 50% were taught by non-tenured, non-tenure track faculty. There are faculties of education and social work where more than 75% of the faculty are neither tenured nor tenure track. But we don't have consistent, reliable data. What we do know is that the pattern is like the American pattern. Whether our percentage is 70% off or 60% off or 55%, we don't know, but the pattern is very similar. A lot of people explain this as a university as the employer's response to diminishing revenue. And unfortunately, that's not an adequate explanation. What I want to show you is the data of total university revenue in Canada from 1972 to last year, to 2013, in constant 2013 dollars. So this has taken out the effect of inflation. And what you can see is a significant increase in the total revenue that universities are receiving. So many of the problems that we face in terms of contracting out, shifting jobs to contingent labor, cannot be adequately explained by the underfunding of universities. There's no doubt that governments have cut back on their funding. This table I'm about to show you are the data for Ontario. In 1982, the government of Ontario paid about 78% of the cost of running universities. So about 78% came from government sources. That's gone down to now it's under 45%. And guess where almost all of that money that's lost is now coming from?
Corporation.
Wrong. Your students. And now, in fact, in Ontario, students' tuition fees pay more than 48% of the cost of operating universities, and money from government pays about 44.5%. So the amount coming from donors and corporations is important, but it's really quite small. Almost all of the decline in government funding has been shifted on to students and their families. But the result is still the overall total revenue of universities is increasing. So what has changed is not how much the universities are getting. That is, they're not funded adequately given the growth in the number of students, but the problems they're facing don't explain their labor force policies. This is a chart that looks at, this is a chart of total university operating expenditures, total university expenditures from 1972 to 2012. And the next line I'm going to put up is the percentage of each university's budget that's spent on what's called academic rank salaries. These are data from the Canadian Association of University Business Officers, which is the closest approximation of the percentage of university budgets that are spent on regular academic staff. And you can see there's been a consistent decline since 1978 to now we're, for the last decade, have been just at or under 20% of total university expenditures are for academic rank staff. So there has been a change, but it's a change in how the universities and their boards and their administrations have decided to spend their budgetary allocations. So that was the first problem. The second problem is the difficulty in those who do have research as part of their job to be able to get funding. This is a table that shows you the funding for the 3 granting councils and for the Canadian Foundation of Innovation and how it's changed during the years of the Harper government. And again, this is in constant dollar terms, so it takes out the effects of inflation. The funding for SSHRC has declined by 10.5%. The funding for NSERC has declined by 4.4%. The funding for health sciences for the Canadian Institutes for Health Research has declined by 7.5%. So if any of you have been applying for grants and are finding it more difficult, part of the reason is that the granting councils are getting less money in real dollar terms. Secondly, though, the government appoints the governing bodies of each of the granting councils, and it's been changing the makeup of them. It used to be overwhelmingly academics. Now on SSHRC, for example, representing all the humanities, there are no philosophers. I'm sorry, there's one philosopher, there's no historians, there's nobody from language, there's nobody from literature, there's nobody from sociology, nobody from anthropology, nobody from political science, nobody from law, nobody from education. There are 6 from business, 3 from economics, and the head of industrial trades training at Red Deer College. The granting councils, because of the changing makeup, have been setting different priorities. This is from the latest report on plans and priorities from NSERC. And it shows how NSERC's been spending its money. It breaks it down into 3 categories. The first category is people, or what they call research talent. And that's primarily fellowships for graduate students and money for postdocs. And as you can see, that's declined from 2010 to this year by 22.9%. The second category is the advancement of knowledge. These are discovery grants and others. It's declined by 16.3%. What has increased are the designated programs that the government has encouraged of partnerships with industry, which have gone up by 25.3% in funding. The overall impact of this, and I'm not going through all the granting councils because of time limitations, is, look at that last column. This is the success rate for the main granting program of each of the 3 granting councils. So for the SSHRC Standard Research Grant, Insight Grant, been changing names, the success rate is 21%. For the discovery grants, for those of you not in the natural sciences, NSERC doesn't give grants based on projects, it gives them based on people and tends to give smaller amounts to more people and is what allows people to get labs started and be the base of their work. It's down to 59%. And for the health sciences, CIHR's granting success rate is 16%. Now I'd like to just move to the hollowing out of academic freedom. I'm going to be talking about 3 things that are happening with respect to academic freedom. The first is the attempt to narrow the scope of academic freedom. In Canada, the tradition of academic freedom has its origins in a statement on academic freedom that was put forward by the newly formed American Association of University Professors in 1915. As a result of some really terrible treatment of academics in the first part of the 20th century, a group of academics led by John Dewey and others came together to form the American Association of University Professors. And one of their first actions was to create a task force to develop a statement on the principles of academic freedom. And that is one of the best statements on academic freedom that's ever been written, and is the backbone of how we understand academic freedom in Canada as well as the United States. That was modified somewhat by the 1940 statement on academic freedom by the AAUP, and then CAT was formed in 1951 and has developed its own statement based on these that is the guide for academic freedom in Canada. All of these recognize 4 components of academic freedom. That is your freedom in your teaching. That is to have the freedom to teach, decide on content and readings and tests as is best in your best professional judgment, and not beholden to the wishes of the administration or of donors or of the premier or of special interest groups. A similar right is recognized in regard to your research and scholarship. That you have the freedom to do the work, you have the freedom to publish what you find, again, unbeholden to what may be the wishes of the administration or donors or special interest groups. A third component is what's called intramural academic freedom, and that's the freedom to comment on anything that's going on in your own institution. I mentioned at the beginning, academics don't have a duty of loyalty to their employer. If you work for Canada Post or the Royal Bank and you write a letter to the editor in the spec denouncing a policy of your employer, you can be fired, unless you have a strong union that has language to prevent that. In a university, the right to be able to be critical of any aspect of what's going on in the university is seen to be a core feature of collegial governance. How can the faculty collectively play a governing role if they're restricted in what they can say or argue? So that's called intramural academic freedom. And the final component is extramural academic freedom, and that is your right as an academic to exercise your rights as a citizen without punishment by your employer. So if you participate in an environmental rally and get arrested for civil disobedience, you can't flash your McMaster University card and show it to the cop and say, I have academic freedom, you can't arrest me, because that will probably just get you a hit over the head. But you can expect that the university cannot sanction you for the exercise of those rights. So academic freedom is a professional right of academic staff to be able to be unconstrained by conventional wisdom, by wishes of administration, by donors, by politicians in doing their work. So they can do their teaching and their research and play their role within the university and the community. This vision of academic freedom has now come under attack. In the Organization of University Employers, this is actually the Organization of University Presidents. It's called the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada. And in 2011, it had its 100th anniversary. And it took the occasion of its 100th anniversary to adopt a new statement on academic freedom. And it was quite appropriate that they did it on their 100th anniversary, because they were attempting to take the concept of academic freedom back to what it was 100 years ago. Because their statement has no recognition of intramural academic freedom, nor no recognition of extramural academic freedom. A second aspect of the hollowing out of academic freedom is the casualizing of the academic workforce, the very thing I was talking about earlier. How do you provide and ensure academic freedom for those in a precarious employment position? The proportion of contingent positions in Canadian universities is significant. Academic staff require academic freedom to be able to do their jobs, whether teaching or research. The right to academic freedom in Canada is only protected by what's in your collective agreement, or in the case of at McMaster, in the university handbook. There is no protection in law for academic freedom. The only protection is what you've been able to negotiate or achieve in your institution. And the issue is, how can that right be protected and enforced for those in contingent positions? Because after all, if I'm hired on a contract to teach a political science course, and for some reason offend the dean or a donor or the premier, they don't have to fire me. They don't have to take any action that would ostensibly be a violation of academic freedom. They just don't renew my contract. So it's very difficult to protect the academic freedom. So the answer to that last question is not easily. And as the proportion of academic staff that are in precarious employment positions grows, and it's probably a majority in Canada currently, academic freedom is diminished and hollowed out. And finally, the newest way in which academic freedom is being hollowed out is an attempt by universities across the country to enforce civility and respect. And I want to spend a minute talking about that. And I want to begin with an important distinction. Universities, like all their employers, have an absolute obligation to ensure a violence-free, discrimination-free, harassment-free workplace. These things are against the law. Employers have an obligation to ensure they don't happen in their institutions. Where the problem has come is as universities have brought forward the concept of incivility or disrespectful behavior and have tried to treat it in the same way they treat harassment. I'll give you some examples. At Brock University, they have a respectful work and learning environment policy that begins, Article 8 of it is quite right. Each individual has the right to participate, learn, and work in an environment that promotes equal opportunities and prohibits all forms of harassment and discrimination. Absolutely right. The next paragraph, however, says Brock University and all members of the university community share the responsibility of establishing and maintaining a climate of respect within this community and to address any situations in which respect is lacking. So this is this gradual slide from harassment to disrespect. Or at the University of Manitoba, their respectful learning, work and learning environment policy, again, begins properly. The University of Manitoba does not condone behavior that is likely to undermine the dignity, self-esteem, or productivity of any of its members and prohibits any form of discrimination or harassment, whether it occurs on university property or in conjunction with university-related activities. But it too goes on. The University of Manitoba and all its members of the university community, particularly those in leadership roles, share the responsibility of establishing and maintaining a climate of respect within this community and to address any situation in which respect is lacking. That's not true. Or the University of Toronto, guideline on civil conduct begins with a statement: the university will not condone uncivil conduct. The guideline is not intended to infringe academic freedom, and all of these always say that, but rather to describe conduct expected of all members of the community, even when exercising their academic freedom. Ryerson says, nothing in this policy shall be construed to impinge upon academic freedom provisions specified in the university collective agreements or policies. However, faculty, instructors, and others who have academic freedom rights have a responsibility to exercise these rights in a civil and respectful manner. Well, unfortunately, language creates a hole that you could drive a very big truck through. So the issue becomes, well, what is incivility? Brock deals with it by saying personal and psychological harassment does not include respectfully expressing disagreement or stating a contrary but reasonable point of view. Well, I'm not sure I want the dean or the president deciding whether my comments, like what I'm making right now, are respectful or reasonable. The legitimate, i.e. not discriminatory, arbitrary, or abusive exercise of academic freedom, freedom of thought and inquiry, and expression in teaching and research, which may result in respectful disagreements regarding beliefs or principles. Well, people who've disagreed with what I've had to say and have been forceful about it have seemed pretty disrespectful to me. Often somebody who's praising what I'm doing seems very respectful. Or at Ryerson, incivility deals with a broad range of behaviors, including but not limited to, now this is incivility, unprofessional behavior, I'm not sure who defines that, rudeness, I'm not sure who defines that, shouting or swearing, intimidation or bullying, threatening comments or behaviors, actions, unsolicited and unwelcome conduct, comment, oral or written, including email communication, gestures, actions, or contact that may cause offense, humiliation, physical or emotional harm to any individual. Now, we've had policies like this where students have filed complaints because a faculty member wrote in their paper, this is a sloppy piece of work, and you have obviously not taken the assignment seriously. The University of Toronto tries to be clear what it means by civility and incivility. The following are examples of behaviors that are not in and of themselves considered uncivil conduct. Normal management action taken in accordance with relevant collective agreement or employment contract. Comments made in the context of peer review processes. Differences of opinion or debate conveyed in a respectful manner. Right? So we define civility by saying it's being respectful. I'm not sure that solves the problem. Interpersonal conflicts where the parties remain respectful of one another. Now, there are a lot of universities spend a lot of time trying to figure out. My favorite is the University of Maryland. It had put together a whole group of faculty that produced a white paper called the Civility Discourse. And they come to the nub of what civility is. We define civility simply as niceness to others. In accordance with President Perman's emphasis on playing nice, we believe that niceness may be easily understood by all parties affected. We define incivility as low intensity, deviant behavior with ambiguous intent to harm the target in violation of university norms for mutual respect. So the problems with this kind of language is it disallows a lot of behavior that is not only common but beneficial. Satire, caricature, hyperbole, aesthetic mockery, polemic, outrage, anger. You know, as academics, we can be angry about some things that are said or done in our field. And it would put a lot of people out of business. The other problem with this is the fundamental vagueness of these terms of civility and respect. Probably the leading legal authority in Canada on freedom of expression is a very senior professor at Osgoode Hall Law School named Jamie Cameron. And she wrote an article recently, in fact it's in the book that Don mentioned, where she looked at this issue. And she commented, and I just put this up, when and in what circumstances another person might take offense at things said in a certain way is unpredictable and highly situational. civility policies necessarily lend themselves to selective enforcement. Though most will not, some offenders will be singled out for institutional attention. By definition and in practice, even-handed application of the standard is impossible. Short of a pattern of behavior that satisfies definitions of harassment and bullying, mere rudeness and a lack of courtesy is just too pervasive and constant to be sensibly regulated. The implications of trying to regulate civility and respect vitiate any meaningful notion of academic freedom. And I could give you loads of examples, and if this were a talk just about academic freedom, I would. These are all very prominent victims of respectful workplace and civility policies. And one of the most interesting cases is the chap in the middle, Stephen Slide at the University of Illinois. But I'll deal with these questions if you want to pursue that, but they really illustrate the general points I was mentioning. Lastly, I want to come to the hollowing out of collegial governance. Oxford and Cambridge were founded and took seriously the notion of collegial governance because at Oxford, a body called the Congregation and an equivalent body at Cambridge called Regent House are the final decision-making authorities on all matters within the universities. And those bodies are made up of the totality of academic staff in the institution. There is no board of governors that has authority over the final decision-making body on all matters in these two institutions are the collectivity of the academic staff. In Canada, we had a commission that was set up, it was actually set up in Ontario in 1906, to look at the issue of governance of the University of Toronto. It was called the Favela Commission. And it came forward with a proposal not to go the Oxford-Cambridge route, but to have a bicameral system. A board of governors responsible for financial and administrative matters, and a Senate responsible for academic decisions. And that was the way in which we were going to have collegial governance and have the academic community have control over academic decision-making. And that model became the model that was used by every university founded in Canada after 1906, and for those universities in Canada that had been founded before 1906, became the model that was adopted by them. And McMaster is an example of that currently, as are most every other university in the country. The difficulty is it's never worked very well. There was so much concern about the theory that this model would give academic staff the effective control over academic decision-making, seemed so problematic that in 1966, the forerunner of the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, that is the Organization of University Presidents, and the Canadian Association of University Teachers formed a joint task force to look at what was happening in terms of governance at Canadian universities. Two very esteemed academics, one British, one American, named Birdall and Duff, traveled the country for several years looking at what was going on in university governance in Canada. And they noted the charges that one so often hears today, that universities are becoming so large, so complex, and so dependent upon public funds that scholars no longer form or even influence their own policy, that a new and rapidly growing class of administrators is assuming control, and that a gulf of misunderstanding and misapprehension is widening between the academic staff and the administrative personnel, with grave damage to the functioning of both. Now, this could have been written yesterday, but it was written in 1966. It's what they heard across the country. So they made a whole series of recommendations to modify how senates operated, how boards operated, in order to fix the problem. And those recommendations were adopted by every university in the country. 30 years later, it seemed to many people that nothing had changed. So CAUT set up an independent study group on university governance with the unattractive acronym of ISGUG, which got 3 prominent academics who traveled the country. This was the first one, I'm sorry, this was Duff and Birdall's report, who traveled the country and reported what they found. And what they found was consistently suggested during our hearings that the control of the university had fallen into the hands of an administrative group of senior officials, the president, vice presidents, and deans, and that this group, in fact, ran the university without genuine accountability. One of the few people who studied university governance in Canada is a faculty member at the University of Toronto, now an associate dean at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, Glenn Jones. And he did a study of senators, interviewed senators in early 2000 across the country, and he reports Senate members indicated less satisfaction with the overall work of the Senate, and there were indications of discordance between the role they believed the Senate should play and the role they believe the Senate does play within university governance. Less than half of Senate members view the Senate as an effective decision-making body, though 64% indicated that it plays an important role as a forum for discussing issues. Examination of these issues have also been undertaken in the United States. There was a very good book written by Benjamin Ginsberg, very senior professor at Johns Hopkins University. And he argued that what we've seen is faculty governance moving from faculty self-governance to administrative dominance. Senate members as recently as the 1960s and 70s, he said America's universities were heavily influenced and not driven by faculty ideas and concerns. Today, institutions of higher education are mainly controlled by administrators and staffers who make the rules and set more and more of the priorities of academic life. So the consistent findings of anybody who systematically studied our system of collegial governance is that it really has been largely hollowed out. That the notion of collegial governance is more an illusion than a reality. The fact that faculty may win 10 or 15% of the time may be enough to keep them committed. If any of you took first-year psychology, you know Pavlov found that inconsistent reinforcements is one of the best ways of building commitment. But the fact is, collegial governance has not achieved its objective. One sees the priorities of universities, again, the absence of Canadian data, I'm using US data. This is looking at the change, the percentage change in the number of employees in US universities by category from the mid-70s to the most recent data of 2011. The first category is the percent change in full-time non-faculty administrators. It's gone up 396%. The second is the number of part-time contract academic staff. It's gone up by 286%. The next category is full-time contract academic staff. Again, people off the tenure track. It's gone up by 259%. The next time is full-time senior administrative staff. Gone up by 114%. The last category is full-time regular academic staff. It's gone up by 23%. So you get a pattern. You begin to see a pattern of what a corporatized university is looking at. But it's happening slowly, and it's happening in ways that the structures and so on are all still around us, but the changes are occurring. So I want to end, and I really look forward to discussion about what we can do. Well, I see there's sort of 4 options. We can just put our head in the sand and hope it doesn't affect us individually. We can be good academics, say, my God, there's all these problems. Let's make a list of them. Let's set up a task force. Let's study them. And we can study them for a very long time while things get worse. Or we can respond, as other of us do, of being cynical and saying, yeah, the hell with that, I'm just going to do my thing and ignore it. Or we can take action. And I'd suggest the future of the university as we understand it depends on that last choice. So taking action means things we can do individually. We can speak out. John Polanyi, Canada's lone genuine Canadian Nobel laureate in Canada, has spoken out on corporatization of the university in many different ways and repeatedly and effectively. I mean, he's said things like, at a certain point, we don't have universities anymore, but outlying branches of industry. Then all the things that industry turns to universities for, breadth of knowledge, far time horizons, independent voice, are lost. I mean, having somebody of his stature speaking out about these things does draw attention and is of importance. Or David Naylor, who was president of the University of Toronto, when the AUCC brought in its revised new statement on academic freedom in 2011. And he resigned from AUCC's executive committee in response to that. Now you can imagine how hard it would be for the president of the largest university in the country, who's on the AUCC executive, to resign over a decision made by that body. But he did, and it had an impact. Or Ursula Franklin. I don't know if many of you know of her. She's one of the few real heroes I have in my life. Ursula was the first woman professor of engineering at the University of Toronto, a very distinguished engineer who was outspoken both about the status of women in the university and about the problems of engineers facilitating the kind of behavior that was likely to decimate the world through their work on munitions. But she reminded us that social change will not come to us like an avalanche down a mountain. Social change will come through seeds growing in well-prepared soil. And it is we, like the earthworms, who prepare the soil. We also seed thoughts, knowledge, and concern. I mean, making an argument that if we're troubled by these things, we have to think of what we individually can do about them. And there's lots of those things. You know, I'm hopeful that the things I'm talking about are not unknowns to you, and you may not have, and that you may have examples here at McMaster of those, and you may be concerned about them. And if that's the case, I'd encourage you to share those, you know, your vision of post-secondary education with others. Discuss challenges you face in doing your jobs, and give concrete illustrations. Speak up on campus. Take advantage of the fact that you have academic freedom. And never be willing to advocate for less than you feel you and your students deserve. But even, I would say equally importantly, if not more importantly, it's what we can do collectively. Every university and country has a faculty association. You have a good faculty association here at McMaster, as exists in most other universities. These are issues, I would argue, that faculty associations, they're the only body on campus that represents all of the academic staff or all the faculty. And they have to speak out on these issues. You know, where there are contract academic staff faculty associations and regular academic staff associations, they have to work together to mobilize their members, to speak publicly about these issues, to work with other student and staff organizations on campus, to lobby politicians, to engage in community outreach and education. You know, when the Rotary Club or the SPEC or the CBC wants to talk to somebody in Hamilton about what's happening at McMaster, I'll bet you anything, they call the president's office. They don't call the faculty association. There's something wrong with that picture because nobody has a better understanding of what's happening in the university than the faculty. So we have to find ways to change that so the concerns that academic staff have and that students have are heard in these discussions. And although it may not be my place to do it, I would strongly urge that the academic staff through MUFA certify, and so that you have the additional tools available to you collectively that virtually every other faculty association in the country has. The ability to negotiate on all aspects of your working life, the ability to ensure that whatever you negotiate is enforceable in law, and the ability to negotiate on the whole range of things that affect your life. So I'm just going to end with what may be trite, but the best way to predict the future is to create it. If you want the university to remain true to its public mission in future, we have to make sure that future happens. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. If you want references to any of the material I put up or have comments, and we don't have time to talk about it here, please feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you very much.